All right, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who just joined in the last minute or two, welcome to what we commonly call MPO 101. My name is Chris Lucasina, and I am the Executive Director here at Campo. We also have from our staff, our two Deputy Directors, Shelby Powell and Alex Rickard, who will also be presenting to you later in the training, and Gretchen Vetter, our LAP Program Manager, who will be presenting later today as well. We've got quite a few folks on the training today, so if you are familiar with WebEx, you can pull up your participant window and you can see everybody listed there. Several elected officials and staff from our various member agencies around the region. So welcome and thanks for joining us. You can also see there's a chat function as well. So please use that at any point in time if you have any questions along the way. And there will also be some specific points throughout the day today that we will stop to deal with those questions or offer you an opportunity to ask any other questions outside of the chat window. We're scheduled to go till a little bit past noon today. I think last year we ended up a little earlier than that, so don't worry, we won't have you in front of your screen all day here with us at Campo, and we do plan to have 2 breaks today. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is introduce you to the rest of the staff. You can see there's a couple of slides here, but we have got a full-time staff of 16 and 1 part-time staff member. And so many of you know a lot of these folks on staff, but for those folks that are new or aren't as familiar with Campo, you can at least put a name to a face and even a face to the voice as we go through today. You won't be hearing from everybody on the staff today. Again, just the 4 folks that I mentioned. But I did want you all to be able to at least recognize folks from Campo when you see them out there. So we'll start today by just kind of level setting some expectations. We hope you come away today with an understanding of what Campo is and what an MPO is in general, why we do what we do, and how we do what we do, and then what we do. So we'll cover all of these areas. We'll also have a section later today where we talk about specifically wake transit and the role of Campo in wake transit. And then hopefully by the end of this and throughout, you'll get a better understanding of how this is relevant to you and your communities. You'll see throughout the presentation a couple of icons. The yellow sort of computer with the globe on the screen is indicating when there's a website resource. And then the puzzle with people holding it is noting where there's an opportunity for your community or you as maybe a board member or TCC member to get involved. So with that, we'll jump right in. So MPOs, or Metropolitan Planning Organizations, really started to show up as a need not too long after transportation planning in the United States really took off. And that started, primarily focused on highways, but very quickly regions recognized that other modes needed good, sound transportation planning as well. So a couple of important laws that establish MPOs. Probably the most important one was the federal law passed in 1962 that established what's known as the 3C transportation planning progress. So that's the continuing, cooperative, and comprehensive planning process. And it created regional transportation planning agencies in those urbanized areas throughout the country where you had a population of 50,000 or more. And it was a requirement to be able to get federal funds for transportation improvements. So, like most things, once it gets created, maybe starts when it gets created, MPOs had a pretty small set of things to do, or at least seemingly a small set of requirements and tasks. But over time, that really changed, particularly in the 1990s, where subsequent changes at the federal level created new or expanded responsibilities for MPOs. And just to give you a taste of that, and don't worry about reading every single thing on this slide, it's more meant for effect to help you all understand that since the early 1990s, there have been many updates to federal law and regulations that impact MPOs, as well as at the state level. It actually wasn't, even though MPOs were established in the 1960s, North Carolina general statute did not actually recognize MPOs in 2000. And then have caught up at the state level as well. And all of this culminated in the list version of transportation law at the federal level known as IIJA, or Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And that you can see in yellow on the screen. This continued many of the different themes that had been present in previous federal law, but it also increased things. In particular, it increased funding for the various transportation programs, both the overarching programs that are driven by formulas, as well as the opportunities for various direct appropriations to more local levels. It increased focus on safety, on accessibility, and on complete streets. And it is now pushing for better coordination between transportation planning and housing decisions. So ultimately, the MPOs are federally mandated and funded. They're transportation policymaking organizations. They're made up of representatives from local governments and other governmental transportation authorities. And they are responsible for conducting that 3C planning process. Mpo Boundaries, where membership is determined by federal law, and it is required that those boundaries are reviewed every 10 years. So after every decennial census, we are required to go and review our boundary to make sure that it meets the minimum requirements for Mpo boundaries. And you can see down there, we have the federal citation called out for you on the bottom left part of the screen. And this really is, driving a lot of what we use to set that boundary. And so the minimum is that the boundary includes all of the urbanized area as defined by the US Census, and then any contiguous area that's expected or anticipated to become urbanized over the next 20 years out. And that really, honestly can be a little bit of a gray area. And Campo over the years over the decades has done a few expansions, some larger than others. But we do end up with some fairly good area to work with. This map here is showing you the difference between MPO boundaries and urbanized area boundaries. And so you can see here in the green, that's the Raleigh-Cary urbanized area. And then down here in Johnston County and Eastern Wake County, you have two areas that are urban clusters. And you can see the orange outline is the Campo boundary. And then there's another MPO on the other side of the triangle known as the Durham-Chapel Hill-Scarborough MPO. And you can see where their boundary is as well. And we'll talk more about our relationship with that MPO later today, but we work very closely and cooperatively with them as well. So Mpo functions, our core functions are to establish a fair and impartial setting, evaluate transportation alternatives, maintain a metropolitan transportation plan or regional transportation plan, develop a transportation improvement program, and to involve the public. So that's residents, that's important affected subgroups, that's stakeholders throughout our region. And even though that's listed last, I would submit to you that's one of the most important things that we need to do. So a little bit more, and we'll talk about some of these things again later today, but the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, formerly known as the Long Range Transportation Plan, it seems like every other time they update the federal legislation, they change the names of things that we're doing, but we're still doing the things that we've always done. So this plan is required to be updated every 4 years, and it must cover at least a 20-year time frame. It also must be what's known as fiscally constrained. And so this is not a wish list. This is not a vision plan necessarily. We have to be able to show that we can get the funding we would need to do the projects that are in the plan. The next thing on the screen here, the TIP, Transportation Improvement Program. This is what determines those next in line regional transportation priorities. We developed this cooperatively with North Carolina Department of Transportation. And think of this as the regional CIP for transportation. It has to be consistent with our MTP. So you can't fund something in the TIP that isn't in our MTP. And we'll talk more about how that works a little bit later. And then the third thing you see on there, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are air quality conformity requirements that basically say that any regionally significant project that's in our plan has to meet air quality emissions regulations. And so we are required to do air quality modeling and forecasting with our plan throughout our region. And it's one of the regulatory reasons why it just makes sense for us to work cooperatively with our partners on the other side of the triangle. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about Campo. You can see on the screen here our current boundaries, and all of our jurisdictional members are called out on the map. Campo has elected officials and staff representing 5 counties and 19 municipal jurisdictions. It's all of Wake County and then parts of Franklin, Granville, Harnett, and Johnston counties. All told, our population in 2021 amounts to about 1.4 million people, or a little over 12% of the state of North Carolina's population is residing within Campo. And I believe after the 2020 census, we are not only the largest MPO in the state by spatial area, but also by population at this point. So our MPO is structured very similarly to other MPOs. We have an executive board in other MPOs that might be known as a Transportation Advisory Committee. The executive board is the decision-making authority for our MPO. There's also a technical coordinating committee, and that's made up generally of key staff from the various member agencies. We have a full-time professional staff that serve the needs of the MPO and report to the executive board. And then, of course, we also have our member regulatory and decision-making boards, councils, and committees, and commissions as well for those counties out there. So our executive board, it meets the third Wednesday of each month at 4 p.m. Generally, unless there's a need, they typically will take July and December off. So we typically will have our executive board meet 10 to 12 times a year, and the same goes for the TCC or Technical Coordinating Committee, although their meetings are the first Thursday of each month at 10 a.m. Currently, both of these boards are meeting online virtually. We do not have a date or a meeting set yet to return to in-person operations. So I'd say stay tuned to that. We'll see where I think the next several weeks and month or two lead us. To see who is on those boards, you can see the link down at the bottom of the screen that will take you to our website, and specifically to the executive board, but under the About Us, you can also see the TCC. So our administrative structure for Campo, again, we have 16 full-time staff and 1 part-time staff member currently to help the MPO conduct its business and meet or exceed its regulatory requirements. So recently, Campo has been going through an update of our strategic plan. It's looking like we'll be bringing a first draft of that to the executive board in March or April. But some of the key things that are coming out of that are 2 things we wanted to talk to you about today. The first is strategic focus areas. So those are on the left-hand side of the screen here with the orange background. Public engagement, partnering with others, educating elected officials, policy leadership, and operational excellence. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some operational focus areas. So these are several areas that the board has indicated they would like Campo to do to up our game or increase our activities in, and they kind of fit within the different strategic focus areas. So these operational focus areas are increase in land use and transportation coordination, enhancing bicycle and pedestrian planning in the region, increasing activities and the focus in diversity, equity, and inclusion areas, and continuing our role as a transit champion and coordinator for regional and local activities. And so now, wanted to, in the vein at least of the first operational focus area, we wanted to share with you a brief video on the importance of land use and transportation connections. So we're going to try that here, and we'll see if this actually comes up and works for us. If not, we'll send the link out to you. So I think we should have sound here.
The mission of the Urban Land Institute is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. ULI Triangle supports this mission through our efforts in education, partnering with local governments and institutions, and through the efforts of our members in research and developing ideas around land use and building community. There are rules and embedded practices that are invisible to most people but shape our world in profound ways. Zoning, parking requirements, building codes are all examples. One of these is the Traffic Impact Analysis, or TIA, process. When a large new development is proposed, local governments typically
Give me just a moment and we'll fix that for you. Hope that's better for everybody.
The mission of the Urban Land Institute is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. ULI Triangle supports this mission through our efforts in education, partnering with local governments and institutions, and through the efforts of our members in research and developing ideas around land use and building community. There are rules and embedded practices that are invisible to most people but shape our world in profound ways. Zoning, parking requirements, building codes are all examples. One of these is the Traffic Impact Analysis, or TIA, process. When a large new development is proposed, local governments typically require an analysis of the traffic impacts. There is a standard process. Future trips from a development are estimated by looking up trip generation numbers for each of the proposed land uses. These trips are distributed and added to existing traffic on the street network, and a computer model estimates how much additional delay will occur during peak travel times at nearby intersections. The amount of delay is called level of service, or LOS, and it can range from A to F. What if the delay, or LOS, predicted by the model is considered unacceptable? Typically, there are two responses. Downsizing the development can reduce the trips, or capacity can be added to the intersection with more turn lanes, which means the intersection gets wider. These responses may address the localized traffic impact, but what is the cumulative impact of applying these two mitigations over and over again? Development sprawls further out, and streets become ever more difficult for pedestrians, cyclists, and transit riders to negotiate. The very things that seek to reduce traffic locally may increase it regionally by lengthening travel distances and making other modes of transportation increasingly unattractive or impractical. What if there was another way of looking at transportation impacts? There is. It's called VMT, which stands for Vehicle Miles Traveled. Instead of examining delay at local intersections, VMT analysis asks a different question. How many miles of automobile travel will be added to the street and highway network if this project is built? This may sound like a minor distinction, but it can produce a dramatically different conclusion about impacts. Let's look at some examples. This subdivision on an undeveloped woodland is located in an area with low traffic volumes. There is plenty of capacity at nearby intersections to absorb additional car trips, so it passes an LOS test with flying colors. But it is far from job centers, retail, and services, so the residents will have to drive, and drive far to access their basic needs. From a VMT perspective, it has an outsized impact. This 6-story mixed-use building is located at a high-traffic intersection adjacent to a busy shopping center. While new trips might further congest the intersection, the residents of this building are a short walk from groceries, dining, shopping, and other day-to-day needs. The location is a short bike or drive to major job centers, served by bike share, and the building is also served by 2 bus routes. While a traditional LOS analysis might recommend limiting the amount of new housing in this location, from a VMT perspective, the more regional growth that can be directed to places like this, the better. Further, the anticipated congestion may never occur. Real-world traffic counts post-development often do not show the growth in traffic volumes that the models predict. As a metric, VMT is much more aligned with the climate goals set by triangle local governments. Unlike LOS, VMT has a direct relationship to how much fuel is burned by personal vehicles. Transportation accounts for over 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in Raleigh. What stands in the way of a broader switch to VMT? One factor is inertia. The LOS method has been an industry standard for decades. Engineering firms know how to produce the analysis, and transportation staff know how to review it. The second is methodology. Estimating VMT is harder than LOS, requiring more data and more complex models. Third, when a project is subject to public review, most interest comes from nearby neighbors who naturally focus on the immediate issues surrounding the site rather than the broader issues for the region. Fortunately, the science of VMT has made great strides, in part because California, the largest state, implemented a switch from LOS to VMT as part of state-mandated environmental quality reviews. Since so many projects in California are subject to environmental review, traffic engineers have had to quickly build and refine their models. The physicist John Wheeler once said, "We make the world by the questions we ask." LOS asked the question, how can we keep this intersection flowing freely? The usual answer to this question, wide roads and low densities, hasn't worked out in practice as a region grows. VMT asks a different question, which is, how can we create a world where people drive less? It turns out the answer to this question, mixed uses, build more densely, provide travel options, not only reflects where market demand is headed, but also what is needed to build more sustainably. Join us on February 9th at 1 p.m. to explore the California experience with VMT analysis and its implications for the Triangle, with 2 speakers from California representing practice and academia, followed by a panel discussion with local leaders and developers. Finally, a special thanks to the ULI Triangle Transportation and Infrastructure Committee team who spent countless hours developing this program and producing this video. ULI's strength comes from the commitment and volunteer spirit of its members. If you have any questions or would like additional information, please contact ULI Triangle's Executive Director, Robin Hilliard, at robin.hilliard@uli.org.
All right, folks, just a second here. We'll switch it back over. So, hope you all could see and hear that video. If not, we're happy to provide it to you. It's something that we've been having more recent discussions on in our region, and I think we'll continue, but it's certainly one area that the Campo Executive Board has indicated they want the MPO to get more involved in. To be clear, land use decisions are still local decisions, but ensuring that each of our local jurisdictions that have land use authority do understand what that means for mobility and transportation. I think that's the area where our board really wants the MPO to get more involved. So with that, we'll continue on. This next part here is where we're going to talk to you about the various partners that we use and interact with to get things done. So, who is involved with transportation planning in the MPO? You can kind of see there's a lot of folks involved, from elected officials and local agency staff to federal and state agencies, various interest groups, transit operators, and other regional agencies. And we'll talk about a few here momentarily. Most importantly, you know, our partners are you all. Each of the local jurisdictions here in the region are the MPO. That's who the MPO is and what it's created from. Stakeholder groups and the public also are very helpful in informing our process and keeping the MPO moving in the right direction. So the main way that you all can interact, your jurisdictions can interact, is through membership and active participation on our executive board and the TCC. That's where your local community is represented. It's how decisions are made, and it's how a lot of information is collected, analyzed, reviewed, and distributed back out. Stakeholders and technical team members in the variety of what we call special studies. These might be region-wide level studies or corridor level studies, or small area studies that we do every fiscal year. We also work together with the Durham-Chapel-Carborough MPO to have a set of joint or unified transportation policy priorities for the region. These were established a few years ago. They are updated periodically, and it's a great way for you all to have a very good primer and set of talking points on different transportation issues that are important to our region, to everybody in our region, particularly when you're talking with folks at the state legislature or the federal legislative delegation. So we've talked about the Durham-Chapel-Carborough or DCHC MPO a few times. They are our sibling MPO on the western side of the triangle, and they cover Durham and Orange and parts of Chatham County, and include both Durham and Chapel Hill and Hillsborough. They are within the same air quality region as Campo, and we work very closely with them on a variety of projects and topics. We're often partnering with the DCHC MPO as well as North Carolina Department of Transportation and the Triangle J COG when we do various transportation studies and projects, or even when we develop various programs, whether it be the development of our MTP, whether it be the Triangle Bikeway implementation and the study of the Triangle Bikeway, or things like our TDM program, which we'll talk more about later today as well. So one of the big reasons that we plan together is because our region has some very interesting commuting patterns. We don't have everyone in our region going into downtown Raleigh and leaving downtown Raleigh at the end of the day, at the end of the workday, and going back to wherever they're living. We have a lot of cross and intra-regional commuting patterns that we see. So there are a lot of folks who live in Wake County and work in Durham County and vice versa. There's also a lot of folks in Johnston County that work in Wake or work in Durham County. So we have a lot of travel patterns that are very dispersed throughout the region. And that's one reason why it's really important for us to sort of ignore that imaginary boundary between the two MPOs and really try to work together to deal with that sort of travel pattern. Triangle J, Council of Governments. Many of your jurisdictions are also a member of Triangle J, so you're probably very familiar with them. But for those that aren't, they help with that regional cross MPO boundary coordination. They help with both MPOs with the development of our regional transportation plan. They administer our regional transportation demand management or TDM program, and they coordinate between with other regional issues, whether it be housing and land use, water quality, all of those things, and transportation planning. So we've had a very strong relationship with both the DCHC MPO and Triangle J COG for many, many decades. And I think it's been a really important part of the success for our region. Throughout North Carolina, there are also the rural equivalent of MPOs, known as Rural Transportation Planning Organizations, or RPOs. These were first established in law as a reaction to meeting new requirements that came out in federal law in 1998 for rural consultation. In North Carolina, RPOs really were created and became active in the early 2000s. And they work with NCDOT for rural transportation planning. So we have primarily 4 neighboring RPOs: the Curtar, the Mid-Carolina, the Triangle, and the Upper Coastal Plain RPOs. And we work with each of these on the various projects and programs that would interact with that particular RPO and our MPO. One of our very important partners and probably our largest partner is the North Carolina Department of Transportation. For those of you who have been involved with transportation, you know that there are many different units and aspects to NCDOT, and we interact with many of those on a variety of levels, whether it be the Transportation Planning Division that looks at statewide transportation planning, the various geographic divisions. For us, that's primarily working with divisions 4, 5, and 6. The programming unit and prioritization unit, and the variety of others that you can see on the screen there. And these are just sort of the high level, naming a few. In practice, there's probably approaching 100 different units and offices within NCDOT that at some point or another we're interacting with. So a little more about NCDOT. They maintain over 80,000 miles of public roads, second most in the country behind only Texas. So think about that for a second. Texas is a big state, and North Carolina is a big state, but I think sometimes we forget or don't realize how much of our roadway and transportation network the state is responsible for. In North Carolina, counties do not maintain any roads, which is a little bit different than many other states where the local jurisdictions, both municipalities and counties, maintain many of the roads and transportation networks that are out there in those states. North Carolina DOT splits the state up into 14 divisions or geographic areas. Sometimes they're called highway divisions. More recently, they've begun to be called geographic divisions. They also distribute many of the federal transportation dollars that come to the state. They come to NCDOT, and then by law they are distributed out through the different formulas that have been established, particularly for transportation planning activities. They also utilize MPO planning and the output of our MPO planning process to help inform various state transportation project decisions. So it's not just the federally funded projects. Really, any significant project that you would think of in the region, we're working closely with NCDOT and the local jurisdictions on to ensure that we have the type of project that's going to meet our needs. So just visually here, you can see how the state is divided up across those different divisions. Just to orient you, Campo is primarily in Division 5, but our Johnston County areas are in Division 4, and our Harnett County areas are in Division 6. To kind of further orient you, here's a map showing you all of the MPOs and RPOs across the state. And you can see that the entire state is covered either by an MPO or an RPO. And just to kind of, I guess, make the point a little finer, there are a variety of boundaries that you see on this map. And when you overlay that with this map, you can see that there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen in order for anything to happen in transportation. And so it's really important that we work closely with all of our different partners at the various levels and across the area to ensure that we get the right decisions made for the transportation improvements that we need. A little bit about our federal partners. There's really primarily two agencies at the federal level. The Federal Transit Administration is the first one I'll talk about, and they handle public transportation. That's anything from buses and commuter rail to demand response and people movers. This would not include something like Amtrak. That's a little bit different. But through the FTA, federal transit public transportation dollars are provided to our region, and you can see called out there that second bullet point. Each of these funding sources is named after the section of the federal regulation that creates it. So section 5303 or 5307 across all the way to 5340, right? So I think for today, it's not as important for you to memorize those as it is to understand that there's a variety of flavors of transportation funding, and within each mode, there's some very specific transportation funding dollars for a variety of different activities. And so FTA oversees these funds both to the state and to the individual transit agencies as well. And in our region, Campo ensures that those direct federal transit dollars are utilized and are kind of split out across the different transit providers we have in a useful way. Our other federal level, I'd say primary partner is the Federal Highway Administration, along with the Federal Transit Administration. But Federal Highway Administration is where a lot of the highway dollars, bike and ped dollars come from or flow through. It's also where the funding for MPO operations generally flows through into the state. And so as a part of that, they also sort of administratively oversee MPO activities up to and including a once every 4-year review of the transportation planning process and activities of each MPO. We just went through our quadrennial review last calendar year, and the report on that is actually available for you all if you'd like. Those of you who have been on our board got a presentation about that several months ago, but I believe you can get that off of our website as well. They also provide technical assistance and project review assistance on anything that we're working on and feel like we need some assistance with. So this slide here is going to kind of show you there's a variety of funding that we use for our planning activities here at the MPO. I'm going to go across the top here, but I'm not going to go into all the details for you. You can see that here on the screen, and even these details are really summary level. Each of these has a plethora of additional information behind it. So probably the first source are PL funds. These are planning funds that have been made available through federal law based on population for each MPO to conduct MPO operations. This funding source is not adequate to actually complete all of the requirements that we have as an MPO. And so in addition to that, we also have surface transportation block grant program funding that comes directly to the MPO. This funding source, the majority of it actually is used in our LAP program, which Gretchen will talk about later today. But some of it is used to help supplement our budget and annual work program for MPO operations. SPR funds, state planning and research funds, these are federal funds that flow to the state and are used at the state's discretion, and are generally some of the funds that NCDOT will use when they partner with us financially on some of our different projects and studies and plans. We already talked a little bit about the transit funds. In terms of planning activities, that's primarily either Section 5307, 5310, or 5339 funding. Here in our region, we basically have made the decision to allow transit agencies to utilize those funds based on their needs. And from time to time, when our transit agencies partner with the MPO on a plan or a study or something, they'll use some of those funds. And then the final category over there, Wake Transit funding. This is local funding that was created by the referendum several years ago in Wake County, and is utilized primarily for transit activities within Wake County or to the benefit of Wake County. These funds are allocated through an annual work program that's also adopted by our board, as well as the Go Triangle Board of Trustees, and covers a lot of the various planning activities that have been going on over the last 4 or 5 years to get the Wake Transit Plan up and running and on its way to being fully realized. So with that, I'm going to pause for a moment and see if we have any questions. I know I've seen several things kind of popping up on my screen that we have in the chat. So I'm going to ask, I guess, Shelby or Bonnie, if there's any questions that haven't been answered in the chat yet.
Nothing yet.
Okay. Well, in that case, are there any questions from anyone else right now on the call that we can handle verbally? If you want to raise your virtual hand, we'll see that and call you out. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to keep moving on here then. So we're going to get into some of our planning requirements. And so it's not just that we have to do a plan every 4 years. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that. Within the various MPOs that are established throughout the country, of which there's a little over 400 MPOs nationally, there's a subset known as transportation management areas, and those are MPOs where the urbanized area population is greater than 200,000. So it's not the MPO population, it's the urbanized area of the MPO's population. And if it's over 200,000, there are some additional rules and regulations that have to be met in those areas, primarily dealing with congestion management and mobility management. In order to do that, there's some additional federal funding that smaller MPOs don't get, that these larger MPOs do get. And so Campo is one of those TMAs, or again, transportation management areas. We also have our air quality requirements that we have to meet in our planning. And so to do this, we have, again, partnered with the Durham-Trumbull-Carborough MPO. We began lining up and synchronizing our two different plan updates back in 2002. In 2009, Campo and the DCHC MPO partnered and adopted a joint regional plan for the first time, and at the time it won a national award for outstanding achievement in MPO planning. This has continued since 2009, and in 2012 we adopted the 2040 MTP. In 2018 we adopted the 2045, and in February of this year we adopted the 2050 MTP. All of these have been joint planning efforts by the two MPOs. I can tell you it takes a lot of effort to make this happen, a lot of hard work. And so if we weren't in a virtual environment, I would say during the break would be a great time to go up to one of your MPO staff folks and talk to them about that. A lot of hard work by your staff to get that done, and to get it done well. Our joint regional plan continues to be recognized nationally as a best practice, and that joint process continues to be recognized nationally. So some more recent, within the last 5 or 10 years, new requirements that have been updated and created are consultation requirements for statewide and metropolitan planning. So originally, there were metropolitan or MPO requirements that were created, and there were state level transportation planning requirements created. And through all those subsequent federal law changes, that process continued to evolve to require a higher level of consultation and cooperation between the state planning and the regional planning going on, to ensure that things like land use management, natural resources, environmental protection, historic preservation and conservation are all happening in a more coordinated way. It also has been a requirement over the last 4 or 5 years that MPOs establish and maintain a system of performance metrics, and that those then be used to help us and to help us meet our regional goals and objectives. There are also state level targets that are established in a variety of areas, as well as regional targets that are established in a variety of areas. So a little bit more about the current federal legislation, again known as IIJA, or also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So not that it was already confusing enough, they now have multiple names for the same law. So this iteration of the federal legislation, passed last year, continues many of the things that we had under previous legislation known as the FAST Act, particularly when it comes to formula funding. It continues the requirements for intermodal transportation planning. That includes bicycle and pedestrian facilities, things like safe routes to schools, and recreational trails programs. It increased the focus on safety and accessibility that's expected for each region and each state, and expectations for project delivery and climate change are all increased focus areas under this new law. It changed several policies to help better coordinate transportation planning and housing. The thing that probably gets the most attention is that it increased both the Highway Trust Fund programs as well as direct appropriation funding programs across all the modes. I can't remember the last time we saw so many new funding programs created and implemented through one of these periodic federal legislative updates. And just a flavor of those or a taste of those down there at the bottom of the screen in green: carbon reduction programs, protect infrastructure resiliency programs, reconnecting community programs are just a few. There are pages and pages that you can see in any summary, bullet list summary of these new funding programs that have been created at the federal level. And one other note about that, like most things that get created at the federal level, there will be a rulemaking process, and once that process is complete, then things will start to get rolling. So we're estimating that sometime in the next 12 to 18 months, many of these programs will really start to come out, and we'll start to understand what the feds want or are looking for, and so, you know, I think it's going to be really important for all of our jurisdictions and for our region to try and have as many projects ready to go, or as ready to go as we can when these funding opportunities begin to materialize. Under federal law, there's also several planning factors or really focus areas that are established. You can see them on the screen: economic vitality, safety, security, accessibility and mobility across modes, environmental areas promoting energy conservation and improving quality of life, integration and connectivity for people and freight, efficient management and operations, and preservation of the existing system. These are all areas where different programs are focused at the federal level, different funding opportunities are there, and different requirements are in place. A little bit more about federal performance measures. Called out here on the screen are the different areas where required performance measures have been identified in federal law. Everything from infrastructure condition to congestion reduction, safety, system reliability, freight movement and economic vitality, environmental sustainability, project delivery. These are all some of the key performance measure requirements at the federal level. Each of these areas have to have targets that are determined by both NPOs and the state. In our case, those are done by NCDOT. And in some cases, our NPO has opted to adopt the state targets that the state has established. One area that we're looking at changing that is in the safety category. So recently, our board, the Campo Executive Board, has had a presentation on crash data and safety targets, and we'll have a few more coming up in the coming months. And the goal there, I think, is to explore how we might have our own regional targets that can help meet state targets, but also maybe help meet and be tailored a little more customized towards the needs of our region specifically. So with that, I'll stop again.
Alrighty, everybody, we're going to be resuming here in about 30 seconds. So if you could come on back, Chris and Shelby will be taking over the presentation and we'll get started.
All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get back to it. The next portion of today's training will cover a little more detail about the various functions, programs, and end products that we develop here at the NPO. And to do that, I'm going to hand it over to Shelby Powell.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And I trust you can both hear me and see my screen.
All right, so we're going to get started again here and talk about some of the Mpo functions, programs, and products. So Chris talked a bit about our Metropolitan Transportation Plan earlier. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more here in the next few minutes. And the Comprehensive Transportation Plan, which is the unfunded element of that Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We also are responsible for the Transportation Improvement Program, which is the kind of the CIP for the region. It's updated every couple of years for the most part. Sometimes that schedule gets a little off, but generally updated every 2 years. And this is an implementation tool to implement the projects that are identified in our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Alex Rickard and Gretchen Vetter are going to go into a little bit more of TIP information for you here in a little bit. And then we have our Unified Planning Work Program, which is updated and adopted annually by our board, and it does outline our work tasks and our budget for the next fiscal year. So we're currently operating on the fiscal year 2022 Unified Planning Work Program, and at our meeting last week, our board adopted our FY23 Unified Planning Work Program. So every year it identifies the planning activities using federal funds in the Mpo area. And so we'll dig into a little bit of that information as well. So just to give you a visual on how these things fit together, our Comprehensive Transportation Plan is not a fiscally constrained plan. You may have heard there's a bit of a transportation funding crunch in the state right now, so we can't afford everything we know we need in order to accommodate all the transportation improvements that we anticipate needing in the future. So we have our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which has our fiscally constrained projects, so the projects that we know we can afford, given our current picture of revenue sources. We know we can afford those things in the next 25 years. And then the Comprehensive Transportation Plan is more of a vision document on the things we know we'll need next after the things we can currently afford. And then our TIP is an inset to that, and it covers 5 to 10 years. Generally 7 years of for sure funding for things that we know we can build out of our MTP in the coming years. So just a bit more about our Comprehensive Transportation Plan. It is a multimodal vision plan. It does include the modes for our highway needs, our public transportation, and our bicycle and pedestrian transportation needs. We do have a lot of good maps on our website that our GIS staff have put together so that you can see these plans for yourself. And again, the CTP, the Comprehensive Transportation Plan, is the unfunded portion. So we have things that are identified in horizon years in the Metropolitan Transportation Plan that we know we can afford in 10, 20, and 30 years. And the things that we know we need beyond that are identified as our CTP, or Comprehensive Transportation Plan, element of the plan. So our MTP, again, our long-range plan, it does recommend transportation projects, but the planning document also includes other planning needs that we have. It includes programs that we need, programs such as our Safe Routes to School program, our Transportation Demand Management, or TDM program. Things like that are included as well in our long-range plan. And we also have some land use elements to it, although, as Chris mentioned, land use is a local decision and locally controlled here in North Carolina. We do need to consider that because, as you know, land use and transportation are very intricately tied together. And so we have to consider what our land use projections are in order to determine what our transportation needs are. And we also have some air quality conformity regulations that we must follow. So we have to prove that our transportation plans are not putting us beyond our air quality emissions levels that we are allowed to have. So again, this is a federally mandated plan. We do in our plan have an emphasis on the preservation and efficiency of our existing system, making sure that the roads that we have are working for us to their best ability. Things like intelligent transportation systems are included in that, making sure we have adequate transit, adequate bicycle and pedestrian accommodations, just to make sure that our region does have the travel choices that are necessary to be able to efficiently move people and goods throughout our region. We do have a new MTP that was just adopted. Our 2050 MTP was adopted last week. And so you can see that that's a 25-year plan for the region. This plan does have extensive public engagement. You can imagine it's hard to engage with a region as large as ours for a plan as long in the future as ours is. People have a hard time wrapping their heads around what they might need in 30 years. So we do a lot of planning work here at the MPO to really engage people, to help them kind of grasp what we're doing as far as long-range transportation planning and try to put it into the context of how they travel today and how they might need to travel in the future. And projects that get built in our region with federal funds and state funds need to be included in the MTP. And also projects that are being built with, say, developer funds or local funds, if those projects are considered regionally significant, they also need to be reflected in the MTP as well. So I mentioned we have a lot of planning activities that feed into our MTP. We update the MTP every 4 years, but that's not just something that happens every 4th year. We work during the interim time to conduct things such as large area studies. We're about to start up our Southeast area study. We just finished our Northeast area study update. We've done a Southwest area study and a Southwest area study update as well in recent years to help us dig into those areas a little more closely rather than relying on this every 4-year process to look at those areas in a brand new fashion. We also conduct corridor studies on specific corridors in the region. We've done those on things like Highway 56, NC 50, Highway 98. So a lot more specific corridor improvement recommendations in those. We do even smaller studies that we call our Hotspot Studies that are a little more confined in planning area. They include things, we're about to start one up now for the potential Friendship Road interchange at the border of Holly Springs and Apex to try to figure out an interchange design there that can happen given all the development that's going on in that area. So really digging into those kind of things with our hotspot studies. We also do other special studies, things like we did a Rollsville Main Street study, for instance, to help the town of Rollsville determine the future of their main street. So our local governments kind of come to us with ideas and suggestions and areas where they might need assistance with transportation planning, and we will help them with that through our planning efforts. And then those things get incorporated up into our MTP as well. An example, recently Apex updated its comprehensive plan, which included a transportation element, as well as socioeconomic data forecasts, and those things were incorporated into our 2050 planning efforts. So the things that our local governments are doing are considered and incorporated into the overall regional planning work. You know, when they spend a lot of time locally figuring out transportation priorities and solutions to the transportation issues that they have, we like to use that work to help look at it in a more regional context and help us prioritize the things that we need for the region. Another example of a recent study that we did was the Commuter corridor study. This was looking at our major highway commuting corridors in the region. We did several scenarios, as you can see on the right-hand side here. This is kind of the scenario report card, and looked at some kind of wild and crazy ideas for how we might improve those roads. The initial question for that project was, how can we make it so that our highways are not congested? How do we make it so that our capacities are not so challenged in the future, given the volumes that we're expecting on our highways? And surprise, we found that we could not build our way out of that congestion. So a lot of the scenarios that had to do more with how we were planning our land uses in certain nodes really helped the transportation situation more with less impact, especially than, say, widening I-40 to 15 lanes each direction. So things like this help us also to prioritize projects that go into our Metropolitan Transportation Plan and help us to shape some of the programs and policy efforts that we put forth in our MTP as well. So we do have a required performance-based planning approach. We've actually, here at Campo and along with DCHC and Triangle J Council of Governments, have been kind of doing a performance-based planning approach before it was cool, or before it was required. So just like with any planning effort, we have worked with the community and our stakeholders to develop goals and objectives. And then we figure out some performance measures that, tell us, how do we know that our plan is doing what we want it to do for us? And then we set some targets for those measures. And then we develop scenarios and test them against those targets. And then we monitor those targets as we move forward in time to see if there's adjustments needed, and to ensure that we're hitting our measures and targets as a region. Anyone who is on our technical coordinating committee or our executive board is super familiar with this slide at this point, because we did just wrap up our MTP. So this is just a visualization of the process that we go through for our MTP. At the start of it, we develop our vision and goals. One thing to mention that I think is important in understanding how we develop our MTP here in the region, we don't pretend like we're at a clean slate every time. We consider it to be an ever-evolving kind of effort. So we had a 2045 MTP that we did 4 years ago. This is a rapidly growing and changing region. So we needed to go back and review our 2045 MTP as we began to develop our 2050 MTP and figure out what kind of changes and adjustments were needed. Then we move into the analysis stage where we look at our data. This is where we start looking at recommendations from some of those local plans. We work a lot with our local communities to understand kind of their transportation needs and priorities. And we also work to forecast deficiencies on our system and examine our land use patterns and our land use projections. And then we develop a number of scenarios that we test and use that to develop a preferred option. And that is what kind of moves towards the final MTP that gets adopted. You can see in the orange along the bottom there are our different public engagement efforts that go along with each kind of major phase of the MTP planning work. Chris mentioned that we perform our MTP in a joint fashion with the Durham-Chapel Hill-Carrboro MPO. These are just some of the things that we do jointly with them. Although it is a joint MTP, we do end up with separate project lists at the end, but we get to those project lists in a very joint fashion. We do those things separately so that, every time they want to change something in the Durham-Chapel Hill-Carrboro MPO MTP, we don't have to go through an amendment process here on the Campo side. So that's just a kind of administrative detail. And likewise, every time we want to make a change, they don't have to go through a major amendment process. So keeping some of those things separate are administratively beneficial for us, but we do a lot of the planning work jointly. We set up the goals, objectives, and performance measures jointly. We did a lot of the public engagement and outreach around those things in a joint fashion with them as well. We have a joint transportation model that is run through NC State's Institution for Transportation Research and Education, or ITRE. We do have a model service bureau that is staffed with Campo staff, NC State staff, and DCHC staff, and some NCDOT staff as well, that all work to maintain our regional travel demand model. We do joint population and job forecasts using a joint community viz growth allocation tool. We also use consistent financial plan assumptions, which means we are jointly planning for the revenues that we're expecting to get in the region and how we're going to spend those revenues. We also had scenarios that included both Campo and Durham Chapel Hill Carborough MPO areas. So the scenarios were not different between the MPOs, but they were presented to the public as joint scenarios for the entire region. We work consistently to fulfill environmental justice methods and do the analysis of benefits and burdens of transportation projects and programs on our more vulnerable populations. We also do a lot of that interim planning work jointly between the two agencies and across the region. So for instance, when we're looking at the commuter rail project, that's obviously something that would span both Durham Chapel Hill Carborough and the Campo region. So things like that that's being managed by Go Triangle, but it's being jointly participated on by Campo and DCHC, so that we have similar expectations and anticipation of how and when that project would happen. Same with things like US 70, NC 98, and some of the programs like our Transportation Demand Management Program. And then finally, we do produce a joint final report for the MTP. John Hodges-Koppel at Triangle J Cog really is kind of the keeper of the report and helps us collaborate between the two regions and ensure consistency in the things that we're reporting and the way we're reporting it. So moving on to our Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. This is our annual budget and work program for the MPO. So this lays out what federal money we're getting, what state or local match we're getting, any other state funds we're getting, and the work tasks we're going to spend that money doing, either internally or through consultant work. So we have things that we consider to be our core mission work tasks. Those are kind of our alphabet soup of responsibilities, such as the CTP, the MTP, the TIP, the LAP or LAPP, just the core things that we have to do to make the MPO work. And then we also have what we consider our non-core mission work tasks, which are those kind of special studies that our partner or member agencies may suggest or need that have a less than fully regional benefit to them, but still will benefit the transportation planning for the region in some way, shape, or form. So the MPO will participate or manage some of those things in partnership with our local member agencies. So I mentioned we just adopted our fiscal year 23, which will begin in July of this summer. Fiscal year 23 will start. So some of the things that we will be taking on in our next year's work program are continuing some of the work that's going on right now. I mentioned our Southeast Area Study update is about to kick off any minute now. We also have a mobility management implementation study that's underway right now. It's really kind of just getting up and rolling. You may start seeing some presentations about that at meetings. That's really to figure out a way within the Campo region that we can coordinate mobility management to help customers access the variety of transportation options that they have if they cannot access a fixed route bus system necessarily. We are also currently doing a major investment study to look at extending the bus rapid transit lines that are planned for in the Weight Transit Plan. So Campo is managing the study of those extensions on the west side from Cary out to Morrisville and RTP, and then on the south side from Garner down to Clayton. We have a couple of new studies that are recommended in our work program for next year. One of the things we do for prioritizing highway projects in the MTP is called our payback period metric. That's looking at what benefit we're getting over a period of time from making a transportation improvement to a road. How much congestion are we relieving, or how much mobility are we offering in response to how much we're paying for that improvement. So we've used that to help prioritize projects, and we're going to try to figure out a way to expand that so that the benefits of our payback period are not solely focused on congestion relief, but maybe focused on some other things like vehicle miles traveled, or other things that we're going to try to figure out through that study. We're also going to modernize and update our bicycle and pedestrian element of the MTP. There's, especially through the pandemic, there's been a much higher focus on desiring bicycle and pedestrian transportation connections. And we're going to look at our regional plan in that realm and figure out how we can make that a little more useful and current for our member governments to be able to utilize for long-range planning. We also have a Fayetteville Raleigh passenger rail study. We conducted phase 1 of that study 2 years ago now to look at just the feasibility of passenger rail between Fayetteville and downtown Raleigh. There's a couple of different options you can use for that. There's a couple of different train tracks that exist today that you could use for that. And so figuring out which one of those would be a better option and how that passenger rail service may progress would be the target of phase 2 of that study. And then there's a regional connected communities project that Triangle J Council of Governments has applied for grant funding for, and we have included that project in our UPWP so that we can contribute MPO staff and resource to that as necessary if they're successful with the grant, and possibly partner with them and figure out how to do some version of that if they're not successful with that grant. On the right side, you can see our ongoing programs that we do that are also identified in the planning work program. So those include, again, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, our locally administered projects program, our TIP, our Unified Planning Work Program, the Wake Transit Plan Administration elements that Campo is responsible for, which we'll get into a little bit later today, our Public Engagement Program. We do administer the region's Mobility Coordination Committee, which is a committee that came out of our locally coordinated human service transportation plan to help our human service agencies and transit agencies come together and figure out how to best administer some mobility across the region. The mobility management study that I mentioned earlier came out of that committee as well. We also have what's called our congestion management process, which is another federally required, well, it used to be a federally required thing, now it's a federally recommended thing that we do in large urban areas such as ours to figure out what's causing our congestion and how we can best manage it. And then I mentioned our travel demand model and just general transit coordination that we do at the MPO throughout the region. One other part of our Unified Planning Work Program is called our Mpo Self-Certification. Chris mentioned a little while ago that we had our quadrennial certification review last calendar year. In the interim between those kind of hardcore in-person quadrennial reviews, we do a self-certification. So we have to answer this list of questions to tell how the MPO is meeting our federal planning requirements and what kind of activities that we're doing that meet each of the requirements. And so that's included as Appendix C in our planning work program as well. Just some other MPO programs that are always going on in the background, even if you don't hear about them at every meeting. Again, our travel demand model. We do have 2 full-time modelers on staff that work on maintaining our travel demand model and help us, run scenarios and use that model for our planning work as well. We have a transportation demand management program that is run regionally that we fund with our CMAQ, or Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality funding. And we also contribute staff to helping manage that program and make sure those funds are being utilized in an efficient manner across the region. Vision Zero is something that we are involved in. We don't have a specific Vision Zero plan, but we do have Vision Zero elements. At our recent meetings, you heard a lot more about some of the safety efforts that are underway at the state, and we're going to be digging into that a lot more here at Campo in the coming months and weeks. Safe routes to schools. We helped manage a pilot program for a couple of safe routes to school projects that were looking at how the Safe Routes to Schools program and projects could be identified and funded and utilized to benefit schools in our region. And so some of that work will be replicated at other schools. Kenneth Withrow on our staff runs a Safe Routes to Schools committee that meets, I think, every other month now. And they will do things like review walk audits and trade best practices information about crossing guards and other school-related transportation safety issues. Our congestion management process I mentioned on the last slide. We will be updating that in fiscal year 23, so stay tuned for some work on that. Last time we really did a heavy lift effort on that. We created an incident management program and helped bring together law enforcement agencies from across the region to help guide the efficiencies of dealing with incidents on the highway. So some good work came out of that last time we dug into it, and so hopefully it will again this next time. We also administer what's called the US1 Council of Planning. Way back in 2009, the MPO did a planning study on the US1 corridor north of 540, so from Raleigh all the way up through Wake Forest and into Franklin County. And in order to maintain the viability of the recommendations of that corridor study, we created what's called the Council of Planning. So since that time, every time a development has come in along that corridor, it has come before the US1 Council of Planning to ensure that it's not being developed in a way that's destroying the integrity of the US1 corridor project, which is now a funded TIP project and is moving forward and hopefully is costing less than it would have had we not had the Council of Planning in place to kind of protect the corridor and do appropriate planning, appropriate multi-jurisdictional planning up there to ensure that we could put that project in place once its time came to be funded. We do have a public participation plan that Bonnie Parker on our staff maintains and administers, and this deals with public comment periods for things like our TIP amendments and our MTP and our NTP amendments, but also has good information in it that we can utilize when we're doing planning studies. And we're looking to update that plan here in the coming months to have some better defined engagement targets that we can set for the region so that we can make sure that we're evolving our public participation in a way that matches the growth of the region. And finally, we run a mobility coordination committee that I mentioned a few minutes ago. That's an outcrop of our locally coordinated human service transportation plan that helps our transit agencies work with our human service transportation coordinators across the region to ensure that we're utilizing best practices and having efficient transportation opportunities for more vulnerable citizens across the region. So I'm going to toss this over to Alex here in a minute to talk about our statewide prioritization process, which is the method by which we get federal and state funding on our TIP projects here at the MPO. And then Gretchen Vetter is going to talk about our locally administered projects program, which is our own homegrown competitive source that we use to allocate our federal funds that come to the region for transportation projects. And before I pass it over to Alex, I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. All right, it sounds like none. So Alex, I'm going to stop sharing so that you can move on to your part of the presentation.
Okay. Shelby, can I get a thumbs up? You can see my screen now. Audio is good.
Yeah, you have the question slide up, right?
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, we're going to jump right into statewide prioritization, or SPOT. SPOT's been around for a while, I think since about 2009, and at that time it was Strategic Prioritization of Transportation, SPOT. Since then, over whether it's different secretaries, different administrations, we've kind of got away from calling it SPOT, and now you often just see prioritization 5.0, prioritization 6.0, or P6. We still call it SPOT a lot of times. So if you hear SPOT, prioritization, same thing, right? We'll get into information about the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP. And let me just jump right in with a couple background graphics. This is our current State Transportation Improvement Program. So this is from years 2020 to 2029. You can see about 1,700 projects, and this is how the current funding is broken down. Obviously, a major focus on roadway. You see 77% of the funding there going to highway. There was a bullet point Chris mentioned earlier on in the presentation, and I want to emphasize that North Carolina counties do not maintain roads. So all of those secondary roads out there in Campo and across the state are maintained by the state DOT, and that contributes a good deal to why you're seeing that 77% going to roadway. I would imagine that pie chart looks a little different if we look at some of our neighboring states. We move on to the second graphic, which is rather interesting. And this is not total expenditure by county, but this 3D map of North Carolina is showing you, it's a graphic that Campo has produced for a number of years. And this is kind of the return, kind of your return on investment at the county level. Sometimes at the federal level, you hear about donor states and how much federal gas tax in North Carolina is contributing to the federal government, and how much we get back. Are we getting 60, 70, 80 cents back on the dollar? And it's a little bit higher than that nowadays, but we tried to apply that same sort of question to North Carolina counties. And so what you're seeing, again, some older numbers there, but the trend is still valid. You're looking at how much money is being spent in a county compared with how much an estimated amount of revenue for transportation that is generated at the county level. And obviously population plays a large role in that, and as well as the cost of projects. So in the central part of the state, our right-of-way costs are on average much higher than what you would see across other parts of the state. But it costs a heck of a lot to build a bridge out to Nags Head and some of those bigger bridges. And that's why you're seeing like Beaufort, Hyde County, some of those coastal counties with such high expenditures there. And that's a lot to do with bridging and stuff. Likewise, when you see some of those western counties in the mountain, it is not expensive, excuse me, it is not cheap to build a highway through the mountains with blasting and I haven't worked in that part of the state, but my colleagues out there, I know it is not, those are not cheap projects. So here in sort of the triangle area, you can see we're in that 50-75% in the orange category. It's just another way to you know, when we hear, sometimes we hear about all the money's going to this county or all the money's going to this area. You know, you might want to consider how much money is being generated by those areas as well. So just an interesting little graphic there that we've shown. Let me talk about the Transportation Improvement Program, and you can see all the bullet points here on this slide, but probably one of the most important is there towards the end. So you've heard about Transportation Improvement Program. You've heard about State Transportation Improvement Program, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. But it's important to remember those are two separate documents. So the TIP is adopted by MPO executive boards. The STIP is adopted by the State Board of Transportation. Now, both TIP and STIP are 10-year documents. They function basically like a capital improvement program. So you've got funding laid out over 10 years. You've got projects that are showing the scope of the project, the schedule, what year within that 10-year window it falls in, and the cost, and as well as the funding source. Now, the TIP and the STIP have to match up perfectly for projects to advance. So, in some places across the country, if a DOT wanted to do something and the MPO did not, for my board members present today, your action would be to remove that project from your TIP. And now that project can no longer move forward. Now, we try everything we can at a staff level to make sure we never get to that point, but it's important for you all to understand how the system is set up. So you each have, the Board of Transportation and the MPO each have a role to play in deciding which projects move forward. So back to some of the details. It's a 10-year document. Usually the first 5 to 6 years of that TIP are considered committed. We think about those projects being sort of locked in. So they're safe. They're not being constructed yet necessarily, but the funding is meant to be secure, and they're sort of on deck for the next batch of construction. One note there has to conform to the state implementation or SIP, and that deals with air quality conformity. We move on. Another item about our TIP, it has to conform with our MTP, our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which Shelby just mentioned. And so, again, if there is a project, it cannot make its way into the TIP or SIP without being in the MTP. So, for example, there have been some MPOs across the state where there was a desire maybe at a state DOT level to widen a highway or a freeway. The local MPO was opposed to that. So they didn't include that widening in their MTP. Now that project can't move forward. This is just another mechanism for the MTP having some control, some say over what happens. See a question I think about MTP and TIP maps. There are maps on our website. Let me get back to the chat here in just a minute. So now let me jump into SPOT, because SPOT is how we create the State Transportation Improvement Program, and therefore our TIP. I'm a big fan of SPOT. My staff here might joke that I nerd out too much on SPOT, but I think SPOT is a great improvement in developing a STIP. And let me jump back and talk about maybe what life was like prior to SPOT, and I won't take much time, but the point being, SPOT provides structure, it defines roles and responsibilities, it provides transparency in how we create a STIP. And prior to that, you have MPOs, RPOs, county transportation, General Assembly members, any number of groups submitting requests to the state on, we want this project funded, we want that project funded, here's our priority list and such. There were meetings with DOT board members and division engineers. You would go and sit down and talk about how important your project is. And then the state would release a STIP. One former secretary went so far as to call it the state's biggest work of fiction, because you would have projects that were kind of hanging out in year 9, year 10 with a little bit of right-of-way funding. And it kind of, it made a lot of people happy because there were projects out there, and they could go back to their constituents and say, look, our project's in the STIP, but things weren't really moving forward, and it didn't give you a solid document to plan for, and certainly didn't function like a capital improvement program should. So again, SPOT, I think it provides structure, the roles and responsibilities, as well as the transparency. We can now, even if we don't like the results, I can explain to my board members why this project moved forward and another one didn't. So let me go on and say, okay, with SPOT, it is a quantitative scoring system. So there are criteria and different metrics that DOT calculates for different projects that generate technical scores. And then it goes into creating the STIP. In SPOT, MPOs, RPOs, and division engineers are the only ones that are allowed to submit projects. They also are the only ones that get to assign additional points to those projects. And then you can see in the bottom right of your slide, it takes the entire state of North Carolina and it chops it up into what I would call 3 different tiers. And that's a statewide mobility tier, a regional impact tier, and a division needs tier. And there are different scoring rules, and those different buckets compete separately. So probably already gave you more details than I should have on this slide, but let me point out, we do offer what we call like a SPOT 101. And that's like a lunch and learn session. We'll typically do that every couple of years when we get into a new round of SPOT. It covers all of this high level SPOT information. And then we've even, might possibly have a SPOT 201 where we can get into a little bit more details. But there is a link there on your slide where you can go to the DOT website and get far more information about SPOT. So SPOT is the scoring system. Like I said, it's been around. SPOT 1 back in 2009. It continues to evolve every year. There is a SPOT work group that's made up of DOT staff as well as MPO, RPO staff, and other stakeholders. They meet what seems like constantly to review current criteria, different data sources, how we can improve SPOT to get better scores, better competition, and select better projects. Around what I want to say is 2013, 2014 timeframe, SPOT 3, the Strategic Transportation Investment Law came out. And STI did something a little different for SPOT. We had, prior to STI, we had what was called the equity law, where money was divvied out across the state based on population and a few other items. STI formalized how the money would be split out across the state, and I'll get into that. But more importantly, STI formalized the role that SPOT had in creating the STIP. It was no longer a policy or a best practice. It is now law. Thou shalt use prioritization in this scoring system to develop the STIP, and here are some additional rules that go along with that. So in SPOT 6, that's the round of SPOT we would be in right now. It's been canceled because of the funding situation that Shelby referred to. And then starting next year, or later this year, we should see some information about SPOT 7. We give you one bit of information about SPOT schedules. They change constantly. I don't think since SPOT Group 1, we've started with a SPOT schedule and ended without some adjustment. Things are constantly shifting and usually farther back in time. So just be on the lookout for adjustments to schedules. Talk about, I said that one, it formalized the role that SPOT or prioritization plays in developing the STIP, but it also changed how the funding was broken out across the state. So your slide here is showing these 3 colors or 3 different tiers: the statewide mobility, regional impact, and division needs tiers of funding. Now, the money is broken out as in those percentages that you see. So the slide taken from the 1827 STIP had about $20 billion of total investment over that period, 40% by law being dedicated to that statewide mobility category, 30% going to regional impact, 30% going to division needs. Now, the statewide mobility is just that. It's statewide. It covers the entire state. I'll get into eligibility in just a minute. The regional impact, Chris mentioned, he showed you some maps about 14 different DOT divisions. Well, a region is just a pairing of 2 divisions. So for Campo, our first region is Region A, and it deals with Johnston County and Division 4 paired up with Division 1, which goes all the way out to the Outer Banks on the northern part. Then we have in the central part, we have Divisions 5 and 6. Those form together to form Region C. So Campo competes in 2 different regions, Region A and Region C. And I want to point out budget there at the bottom, while 30% of the overall budget goes to the regional category, the allocation for each region is based on population. So there is far more money up for grabs in Region C, Division 5 and 6 grouping, than there is in the Region A category, which is, again, Divisions 4 and 1, just simply because the population is so much greater in that Durham, Wake, Cumberland County areas. And then the last category, the division needs, again, 14 divisions, and they all get the same amount of money, regardless of population. It's an even split. So Division 5, with all of Durham and Wake County, and all of that population gets the same amount of money as Division 4 or any other division. So that's sort of how the money is broken out. Now, there's some arrows in that slide that are important. The system is set up, the system being STI, the Transportation Investment Law, is set up to favor the higher order projects. So statewide mobility projects, their score, as you can see in the slide here, is based 100% on technical score. There are no local points that we assign to those projects. Those scores are calculated. Those projects get programmed in the draft STIP. Now, any project at the statewide tier that doesn't get funded gets to cascade down, gets to fall down and compete for the regional funding in whatever region that project falls in. Then the regional projects are scored and programmed. Any of those projects that don't get funded, again, get to fall down and compete for that last bit of funding at the division level. So a statewide mobility project gets 3 chances to be funded: statewide tier, the regional tier, finally at the division tier. A division tier project gets 1 shot. Whatever division it falls in, that's the only money that project can compete for. So that's the intent, is again for the system to favor those higher order facilities. Now let's talk a little bit about eligibility. What goes into these different tiers? So statewide mobility for roadway, that's going to be your interstate projects. Every interstate in the state automatically falls under statewide mobility. There are also certain NC or US highways, because of their designation, get to fall under statewide mobility also. For Campo, that'll be US 70, US 64, and US 1. And somebody put in the chat if I forgot one, but I believe those are the only statewide tier non-interstate projects. Sorry, NC 540, Wade Avenue. I think that's it. On rail, Class A rail lines fall under statewide mobility. There's no transit in statewide mobility by law, not eligible. Passenger rail, different story, but there will be no commuter rail, light rail, BRT, bus service, none of that eligible under statewide mobility. There's no bike ped eligible at statewide mobility. There are some airport projects that are eligible there. RDU is eligible under statewide mobility, but there's limits on how much funding those projects can get. So let's move down to the regional tier. That's going to be all your other NC and US highways on the roadway side that didn't fall under statewide. So for Campo, gosh, let's see, 401, 50, 55, 54, 56, 98, all of those other highways, NC and US routes within Campo are going to fall under the regional tier. Additional rail services fall under there. There are some regional airports across the state, not in Campo, but those mid-sized commercial airports fall under regional. And there is transit now under regional, but there are definitions for what qualifies as regional. So let's say I could run a BRT service from Fuquay-Varina up through all of Wake County into Wake Forest. That's not regional. But if I run a bus service from Fuquay-Varina to Anger, or if I ran a bus service from Wake Forest to Youngsville, those would be regional, because the criteria is you have to cross county lines and serve more than one municipality. That's not a Campo rule. We don't like it either, but that's the way the STI law is set up. And so that thinking certainly impacts the way we draft up our projects for SPOT. So it is important to understand how that works. On the scoring side, you see in your slide, 70% of the total score comes from the technical data, 30% comes from local input. Bring me to the last category, the division needs. On the roadway side, that's going to be all your secondary roads. And there are a ton of secondary road projects in Campo. It's all of your bicycle and pedestrian projects. It's all of the transit service that don't meet that high criteria of crossing county lines and serving more than one municipality. So, and then it also includes our local airports, which for Campo is, again, the Triangle North Executive Jetport. So those are all the different projects that fall under those three tiers. So again, I could have an interstate or an interchange project. It doesn't get funded at statewide. It rolls down, competes at regional, doesn't get funded there, rolls down, gets to compete at the division needs. But a greenway gets one shot at funding. That's just the way the system is set up. So let me move on. There are three main actions that the Mpo will take related to SPOT. I try to cover these every time we have a SPOT item, just as a refresher. So number one, the Mpo gets to pick which projects go into SPOT. Division engineers also get to pick their projects, as well as your competition, which are your neighboring Mpos and RPOs. We select 44 projects per mode. The base, don't quote me on this because it changes from year to year, but the base is usually 12 projects for everyone, and then you get additional projects depending on the size of your Mpo or RPO. So for Campo, we get to select 44 projects, 44 roadway, 44 transit, rail, bike ped, aviation, and ferry. The next step, after all those projects are submitted to DOT, they run all their complicated technical scoring processes. Technical scores are released, and then the Mpos and the division engineers assign what's called impact points, local impact points. There's 2,500 at the regional level, 2,500 at the division level. Again, the number of points you get is based on the size of your organization. And then the third, and certainly most important step, is the adoption of the TIP. Now, when we adopt that TIP, there are some opportunities for some modification or adjustments of projects. So maybe the draft comes out and a project's in year 6 and another one is in year 4, and the Mpo wants to swap those. Maybe those kind of things can be changed. It is unlikely that something that comes out of nowhere and jumps into TIP. That's not the kind of adjustments that are usually made in that stage. And then, of course, like I said earlier, if there's anything that's in the draft step that the Mpo doesn't support, you always have the option of removing that. But again, at a staff level, hopefully we would have headed that off before we ever get to that point. But those are your three action items for developing the step through SPOT. So let's talk on how do we select our project? Well, it is it looks probably more complicated than it is on this slide. The first thing you're going to do, you have to start with the MTP, because by our policy, our methodology, and there's a link to it in the bottom right of the slide, it is adopted by our executive board and kind of lays out the strategy for selecting projects and assigning points. Well, any project that's already in SPOT or the STIP, obviously, we don't need to select that one again. It's already being constructed, or it's in the holding pattern for funding. Any project that automatically gets to roll over to the next round of SPOT, we don't need to waste one of our submittals on a project that's already going to go in there. So then we start looking at all of these other projects that are in the current MTP. And the goal of this is to find projects that we think are going to be most competitive, most likely to be picked up for funding and programmed in the STIP. There are Mpos and RPOs and other folks across the state who just sort of spread out projects and say, well, every county or every city gets X number of projects, and we'll let them figure out what they want to submit. And that's a great way to make everybody feel good about everybody getting a chance to submit a project. It's a horrible way to actually get anything funded. And I don't mean to be blunt, but that's how it ends up working. we're picking projects and recommending them to our board based on travel time savings, on the amount of delay, the amount of growth that's coming there, and then other specific information based on how that latest round of criteria has been developed for projects. So that's sort of the process. And again, I mentioned maybe a pandemic year might be a little different, but we would normally have a TCC subcommittee. It's got our MTP and TIP subcommittee that meets usually 3 or 4 times. And we end up going through about usually 3 or 4 different drafts of our project list to submit. And I'll go into a little bit more information on what goes into that. But generally speaking, you want to have a good mix of projects. There's different criteria, like I said, for widening versus an interchange versus a roundabout versus a super street. You can think about it almost like a track meet or a swim meet where there's different competitions going on. And your best strategy is to probably have your top projects that fall in all of those categories go into your project list, almost like a retirement fund. You want to be well diversified in your project so you have something competing in all these different competitions. So the second step deals with assigning the graphic here that you're seeing, this mountain. The idea is that the ABCD, those are projects, and the goal is to get them to the top of the mountain, to the construction funding, get them obligated so they can move forward. When these project scores come out, sometimes the technical score is so high that whether or not we put any local points on that project, it's gonna make the cut for funding. And so this notion of wasted effort, I've got some other slides we'll get to, but basically if the technical score is so high that it's going to get funded, there's no need for us to waste our local input points padding the score to make that score even higher. It's going to get funded, so let's let it roll on with just its technical score, and we don't put local points on that project. Even if we support it, might be our #1 priority, but the technical score alone is enough to kind of carry that forward. We don't need to waste those local points. The second option, which is usually a far more difficult conversation with the mayor or a member staff, is when that technical score is so low. It doesn't matter if we give it the full 100 points. There is nothing we can do to make that score get high enough where it's going to make the cut and be in contention for the funding. It's not. In those situations, we have to look at that project. We have to look at why it didn't score well in SPOT. Was it criteria? Is there something we can do to the scope? Is there something we can do to the cost? What can we do to get that project in better shape to compete next time? But our recommendation to our board is going to be, we do not put points on these projects because even with the points, they're still not going to score high enough to be funded. And so the third category are those, that sweet spot in the middle, where they're not high enough on their technical score, but if we give them some extra points, it's enough to kind of kick them into that top tier where they might be in contention for funding. And so the way that looks graphed out, this is one of those funding categories. It could be Region A, Region C, Division 4, 5, 6, doesn't matter. That red line that you see going across there, that's our estimated cut line. It's important to understand how much money is in play for each division and each region. And that dictates sort of how many projects and how far down we can go in the scoring and still sort of make the cut. So in the example here, all of these little gray and blue dots are projects, and they're plotted out. They're based on their technical score, the gray ones being all of our competition, the blue projects being Campo projects. And in this scenario, we estimate that the money is going to run out, that the cut line, this red line, is going to be somewhere around the 40. Now you can see I've got blue projects up here in the 50s, even getting up to 65. I'm not going to put points on those. I'm not going to suggest our board waste those points because they already score high enough. They're going to be in contention. That's that first slide. Likewise, I've got some projects down here that only score a 10. after I give all the local input points, I'm only going to raise the score by maybe 10 points overall. I can go from a 10 to a 20. I am still way out of the money. So again, that's additional wasted effort. But if I find that group of projects around the low 30s right here in the center, if I give them points, and now you can see those are the ones I can get over the red line. And as a region, I have increased the total number of projects for Campo that are now potentially in the running for funding. I've gone from say 10 or 12 projects now to 15 or 16 projects. Still not guaranteed that they're going to make it into the STIP for other reasons. We'll get into that, but I hope everybody can understand that that's the hard facts, I guess, of SPOT. We're looking at this based on simple logic and math, and not so much gestures or just trying to make people feel happy. And there are some folks that will say, well, we haven't done anything for this town, so we're going to give 10 points to this project. And we're going to say, well, again, that's not going to do anything. That would be wasted effort. I'd rather give another town a shot of actually getting a project funded. I hope that makes sense. Again, we have additional SPOT training. You tell I enjoy kind of talking about this, so please feel free to hit me up with an email or phone call, and I can try to explain that better if it doesn't make sense. Let's talk on the scoring now. So now all the scores have been tallied, and the DOT STIP unit has the difficult task of putting all those numbers into a draft STIP. And sort of the first thing you're going to look at is, I mentioned, there's 22 different funding competitions going on and around the SPOT. Statewide, 7 regions, 14 divisions. So 22 different funding competitions. They all have different budgets. They have different, available amounts of money. Some of it's already committed to projects under construction or on deck, so to speak, in that committed status. So that certainly plays into the role. The available funding. You've got what the SPOT score was, that the ranking. Normalization. That's a SPOT 201 topic. But in short, that's talking about how much money is dedicated for roadway versus non-roadway versus sort of a free-for-all where everybody gets to compete openly for funding. And that's a complicated topic, but that certainly plays a role. There's transition period projects. You can think about like projects that are already under construction. If their costs go up, well, that has a ripple effect or a domino effect. And I can only spend $1 once. So if my current projects under construction go up, well, that just makes less money available for other projects coming behind them. There are provisions written up in the STI law. That's probably a SPOT 201 topic also. But a couple of them deal with things like the corridor cap. So there's a limit to how much money we can spend on a single corridor like I-40. So as I-5111 that's under construction now, as those costs continue to go up, we get to a point where we may not submit another project on I-40 because it can't be funded because of the corridor cap. Even though it might be our top project, there are limits to how much funding different transit projects can get. So anyway, that just goes into sort of the details of the STI law. And then probably one of the most significant is that project development timeline. And that has to do with just the nature of the project and what goes into pre-construction work. And I've got another slide that covers that. So beside those different funding categories, we said 22 different funding competitions. Within that, there are 22 funding buckets, right? So now you have buckets within buckets. And so Chris had mentioned some of these funding categories. Gretchen will go over more of these, I believe, but let's leave it as there are different state and federal funding programs that have their own eligibility requirements. And so that also plays a role into what projects can move forward. And sometimes certain projects move forward because they're eligible for these specific funding categories, even if there are higher scoring projects out there. And then last on my list, I guess, for you today is this project development timeline. And this plays a role. Let's take the first row there. This is a fictitious Campo project. has the highest score in the state of North Carolina. It scored an 80, right? So it's the highest scoring project. But if you see the draft STIP when it comes out, we don't have construction in the STIP until like year 9, year 10. Well, what's going on there? Why? That's the highest scoring project. Why is it taking so long to get to construction? Well, you got to look at what that project is. If it's something like, an NC 540, a new location highway, you got a couple of years of right-of-way acquisition. You got 2 or 3 years of design. You've got 2 or 3 years of NEPA or your merger process where you're looking through your alternatives and documenting all the environmental information. So it might take 7, 8 years of pre-construction work before you can get to that. That's just the nature of that project. And it's not a function of how high it scores. It's just that's how long it takes for us to get to construction. You compare that with something like, let's take that third project that scores a 70, and let's say that's some sort of intersection improvement. You don't need right of way. You don't need a lot of NEPA work because it's all going to happen right there. It's just some type of intersection improvement project. Well, we can just put that one straight to construction. When you go back and look at your TIP and your STIP and you remember you've got a 10-year capital improvement program, you've got funding that has to be spent in each of these years. We, as a state, we can't just say, well, we just won't spend money in 2020 through 22, and we'll save that money and spend it all. The money has to be broken out and scheduled by year. So that goes back to our strategy of why it is a smart idea to have different types of projects. You might want to have some really big roadway projects like this 80, right? It's needed for the region. It's a high scoring project, and you understand it might take 7, 8 years to get to construction, but you also know there might be money up for grabs in these first couple of years. And so it's good to have a couple smaller projects that might be lower cost and easier to get to construction sooner rather than later. So I hope that makes sense. The point being, I guess I'm trying to make to you is there is a lot of information that goes into SPOT. It is not a slot machine where you just take your priority list and feed it in, pull the handle, and out comes the STIP. You can do it that way, but to really be successful, you want to understand more about how the money is assigned, how projects are scored, and then how all those scores translate into a draft STIP. With that, let me move in. I think I've got maybe 1 or 2 last slides. Chris had mentioned, you've probably seen this. This is just sort of referring you back to those 22 funding buckets. So again, Johnston County here in Division 4. Those projects compete for division need funding with the rest of Division 4. And this pink sort of area, that's Region A. And those projects compete, with the rest of Division 1. So, a good project I like to show to emphasize sort of the relative competitive nature of SPOT would be like NC 42. So if I take NC 42 from like I-40 back to Clayton, we got that funded through a prior round of SPOT. And 42 in Wake County does not score as well. That has more to do with the competition than it does what's actually happening between Fuquay-Varina and Clayton. So 42 in Johnston County is the big fish in the small pond. 42 in Wake County, when you compare that with 55, 54, 401, and that's just sort of in the surrounding area, not to mention everything else in Division 5 and Division 6, it is a smaller fish in a much bigger pond. Okay, so it's your likelihood to get funding is really relative to your competition. There are a number of projects in Campo, whether they're in Granville or Franklin County or maybe in Harnett County or even Wake. If I could move those projects over into Division 4 and let them compete in Region A, they would be rock star projects. So we have more money in Region C, but the competition is much stiffer. And that's shown here in this slide. So these graphics, I believe, came from SPOT 4, a little old, but the information is still valid for training purposes. So your estimated budget for this 10-year SPOT cycle for Region C is about $754 million. Hope you all can see that. For roadway projects, this time we had 190 roadway projects submitted. That'd be Campo, DCHC, Fayetteville MPO, the RPOs, division engineers. Everybody submitting a total of 190 roadway projects. 79 of those are Campo. Some of those would have been submitted by the division engineer. For $754 million in play, you can see we estimated that our red line, our cut line, would be around a 62.5. And you can see these blue points here. Those are the Campo projects. You can see where our rail projects, where our regional transit projects kind of shaped out. You can see kind of a breakdown of where those 190 projects came from. 47% of them are regional projects in Division 5. What is it? Let's see, 17% are regional projects from Division 6. But this other 36%, these are statewide projects that didn't get funded and cascaded down. So these are either maybe I-95 projects, I-40 projects and such. And again, that extra cut at the money that those projects get, they get to come down and compete for regional money. And to kind of give you a graphic on how stiff the competition is, so for Region C in this graphic here, those 190 roadway projects, this doesn't even consider the rail and the aviation and the transit projects, just 190 roadway projects totaled up to a little over $8 billion. So collectively, these two divisions requested $8 billion worth of roadway projects. Our funding runs out here. If you can see it, this is the blue line. This is where the $754 million runs out. So a lot of unhappy folks, a lot of projects lost out in this round. And Region C is probably the most difficult or most fierce competition for regional funding in the state. And then to make matters worse, if you want to show Division 5, again, divisions, everybody gets the same amount of money. And then this year we had about $102 million up for grab, but 177 projects. The net, 99 of those are Campo. We thought 9 of them might make the cut. And those 177 roadway projects are not quite $6 billion. All right, so you've got $6 billion of ask. You've got $100 million to fund. And I don't even know if you can see this blue line, but there's where the $100 million runs out. So Division 5 is the toughest division in the state to get funding. So this also plays into having a well-rounded project list, but it also goes into if a member were to come to staff and say, we want Campo to submit this $80 million roadway project, and it's a secondary road, well, we'd probably tell you that doesn't have a very good chance of getting funded simply because it's awfully expensive for this very, very small pot of money. So just another one of the factors that kind of plays into how we select our projects for spot cycles. And then my last slide, and then Gretchen's going to take over, just to give you some information on the current situation where we're at. We have our 2029 STIP. We did get funding for the Mooresville to Clayton BRT project. There are managed motorway projects funded in the current STIP. Complete 540 is funded in there. Shelby had mentioned about a funding crisis that we're in, and so again, Spot 6 was canceled basically because we had no money to play for it. All right, all the projects from Spot 3, Spot 4, Spot 5 that were already in the STIP in the hopper for construction, as more and better cost estimates come in, we realized we don't have enough money to cover all those, and so there was no need to continue to go through a Spot 6 cycle, and when there's again no money to play for. So we're going to have a draft STIP that's going to come out this spring. It'll have some major revisions, and while we have been telling you all for the last couple of years that once a project is committed, it's safe, that may not be the case. There will likely be projects that have been prior considered committed that now are going to be kicked out of the STIP and probably have to go through future rounds of prioritization. So we will certainly bring the TCC and the executive board more information on that as it's available to us, and I'll try to answer any spot questions, or I think I'm waiting until if there's spot questions, I'll take them now, and if not, I'll turn it over to Gretchen and she can talk about LAP. And I'm not seeing any questions. So Gretchen, I think you're good to go.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's get the presentation going. All right. Well, hello, good morning. I am Gretchen Vetter, and I am the LAP Program Manager for Campo. So LAP stands for the Locally Administered Projects Program. So LAP is very similar to SPOT in the sense that it is a competitive funding program that assigns funding to projects in our region. But instead of this competition occurring at the statewide level, where Campo projects compete for funding against other projects across the state, this competition occurs at the regional level, where local projects compete against other local projects within Campo to compete for funding that is allocated directly to the MPO. So the projects that we see come through LAP typically are a lot smaller than the types of projects that we see compete in the SPOT process. So when you're thinking of LAP projects, think of things like intersection improvements, small roadway widenings, greenways, sidewalks, and then infrastructure improvements for transit projects. So bus facilities, bus stops, things like that. All right, so next we'll go into a little bit on how the LAP program works. So again, the Locally Administered Project Program, it is how Campo determines what to do with that federal funding that is specifically designated to us as a region. LAP has been around since 2011. It was adopted by our Campo Executive Board, and the real purpose of the program is just to make sure that we're having a equitable, consistent way to allocate those fundings. So two of the goals for the program are shown here on the screen. So it's a holistic approach to identify and prioritize small but highly effective projects, and then also to avoid future federal rescissions to the maximum extent possible. If you were around in 2018, 2019, you might remember that there was a threat of a federal rescission around that time frame. A rescission is basically an action that is done at the federal level where they take back any federal transportation funding that hasn't been spent yet. It is something that is sometimes can happen when funding bills come to a close, things like that. So in order to protect our Campo funding from these types of actions, rescissions, then it is best if we spend as much funding as possible, assign them to good projects, and get them implemented quickly so that the feds can't take the funding back. All right, so next we'll go into how LAP works sort of on an annual level. So first off, we have two committees that are integral to LAP implementation. So we have a steering committee and a selection committee, and they both have different purposes. So first we have our LAP steering committee, and they are really responsible for maintaining the project prioritization system and the schedule, and they also create the annual modal investment mix. So the LAP steering committee usually meets prior to the call for projects. The way LAP works is an annual call for projects where we determine the funding to be spent in the next fiscal year. And so prior to the call for projects, we address any changes that we want to address before the call for projects opens, ways to improve the program, things like that. And then we also establish our modal investment mix, which you can see here on the screen. And so the target modal investment mix is a guide that our selection committee uses when determining how to fund the projects that are submitted in a given year. So the types of eligible projects that can compete through LAP are roadway, bicycle and pedestrian, and transit projects. And so the target modal investment mix for this year and also for previous years has been 65% of investment into roadway, 27% of investment into bicycle and pedestrian projects, and then 8% in transit projects. This isn't something that needs to be stuck to the letter. It's more of a guide pointing out where our priorities should be. And this is based on not only feedback from our local members, but also truly derived from the MTP. So our long-range transportation plan and the needs that we see organized by mode. And as you can see on here, there are some dollar amounts associated with these percentages as well. This is with the assumption of a $25 million annual program, which has been the funding amount that we've used for the past few years. So once the LAP target modal investment mix has been established, changes to the program have been adopted, the call for projects opens with board action generally in August. During that time, we have a quantitative base scoring criteria that local projects in our regions compete their projects with the intention of them competing to receive a score. And then those scores are then used when considering what projects to recommend for the year, which brings us to our next committee, which is our LAP selection committee. And this is a group that meets at the end of the call for projects, and they review all of the projects that have been submitted. They take a look at those quantitative scores, and they ultimately provide a recommendation for what should be funded for the fiscal year. This recommendation is shared to the public, to the TCC, the executive board, and is ultimately adopted by the executive board. So again, we mentioned that this was a quantitative scoring process. So criteria that we look at and use as part of our scoring is shown here on the screen. So there is a local priority component. That's something that the applicants decide when they are submitting their projects. They can use those points around the projects that they submit. MTP compliance, which is just saying that projects that are earlier in our MTP or in our planning documents have a higher priority than projects that come later. Prior agency funding levels, which looks at how much LAP funding an applicant has received over the last 5 years. So you would get an advantage in this process if you hadn't received LAP funding over the past 5 years, just to make sure that we're giving opportunities for everyone in the region to receive funding. Also, there is a project effectiveness component. So that's actually looking at the meat of the project and how exactly that will mitigate issues that the project is trying to address. And then there's also a cost effectiveness measure, which sort of goes into the project effectiveness component as well. All right, so every year, the result of a LAP call for projects is known as the annual LAP investment program. So the LAP investment program is a set of projects that has been recommended for funding and then has been adopted by our executive board to be funded in the next federal fiscal year. Generally, this is a result of the quantitative scoring process that comes through after the call for projects. After a project has been recommended for funding, these projects are completed by the jurisdictions that submit the project. So that's the locally administered part of the locally administered projects program fund. And then projects are tracked and reported on by Campo. So we provide pretty frequent reports on not only the overall funding or the funding status of the LAP program, but also on those specific projects. All right, and here on the screen, we can see a map of the LAP projects that were recommended for funding for the federal fiscal year 2023 call for projects. Our Campo Executive Board adopted these projects formally at their February meeting, so just a week ago. And we're very excited to see the geographic distribution of the projects. You can see projects all the way in the northern part of the region to the southern, eastern, west, and all in the middle. And again, these are roadway, bicycle, pedestrian, and transit projects. And then lastly, just to sort of point out again that target modal investment mix and how that might change or change slightly when it comes to the actual investment mix. Here we can see the target versus actual modal investment mix. So this year we stayed pretty close to the target in roadway with 64% funding. Bicycle pedestrian was a little bit higher than the target at 31%, and transit was a little bit lower at 6% rather than 8%. All right, and so LAP, it is an annual process. It has a very cyclical process for which it works. So it starts out in the spring That's the beginning of the work for a call for projects. And that is when our steering committee meets. We review any issues or technical criteria that we want to address before the LAP call for projects open. So we review any types of changes that we see that might be a good recommendation to improve the program moving forward. And then also the target modal mix is discussed as well. Any changes that are recommended in that target modal investment mix are reviewed over the summer. So the TCC, the Campo Executive Board, and the public all review these changes during a public comment period that usually starts in June and then closes in August. And then in August, the LAP call for projects opens typically at the executive board meeting in August, where those changes are also formally adopted by the Campo Executive Board. And then that call for projects usually runs through the month of October. So the last day of October is when that call for projects closes. And then during the months of November and December, Campo works on our internal scoring processes to validate all of the data that has been submitted. We fill in some of the data that we run on our side, and then we share that information with the selection panel. The selection panel then comes through and provides a funding recommendation, and then those projects are shared with the TCC, Executive Board, and public starting in January, and usually are adopted in February. And so once those projects are formally adopted, we basically bring ourselves right back up to spring, where we get started on the next year and the next call for projects by then meeting with the steering committee and reviewing any changes that we are interested in making to the program. And then the process goes on. So that's the schedule that we have. This was the last presentation before another quick break, so I am happy to answer any questions that we have. And if there are none, then we can move into the break time.
Great. All right, so we will go ahead and get started again. We're going to have a quick segment here on Wake Transit, as Bonnie just mentioned, and then Gretchen's going to go into some of the meat of how to get a project from in your head to on the ground, which is always an exciting part of this session. So Wake Transit, you may recall back in 2016, a referendum was passed in Wake County for a transit tax. And that transit tax was meant to fund the Wake Transit Plan, which was developed in 2015 and 2016. So along with that tax referendum and Wake Transit Vision Plan, we've done a lot of work in the years since then to build a Wake Transit program that is administered by Campo and by Go Triangle as the two lead agencies, with some technical oversight from Wake County as well as the rest of the municipalities within Wake County and RTP. So we're just going to go into a little bit about how that works in general and how that works here at Campo. So the Wake Transit Plan was founded on what we call the 4 big moves. These were to connect the region. You can see here, these are graphics from the original Wake Transit Plan. Connecting the region in that context of Wake Transit was envisioning a commuter rail system between Durham and Garner and perhaps beyond, and regional express bus services, as well as some regional BRT services. The next big move was the increase of frequent, reliable urban mobility. So this map represents what we were planning for to be our bus rapid transit lines, which are represented by those thicker red lines, and our frequent network, which is a regular fixed route bus service that operates at a 15 minutes or better frequency. The idea behind this was that you do not have to plan your life around waiting on the bus, but that the bus would generally be there when you needed it to in a short period of time, so that you could rely on taking the bus for your transportation needs. The third big move was to connect all Wake County communities. This big move was actually achieved last year with the final service offering to Holly Springs. And so while there's still room for improvements to be made, we do have bus connections, at least, to all cities and towns within Wake County now, which was a big goal of the original Wake Transit Plan. And some of that bus service you can see is peak only service or hourly service. And again, as we move forward in time and ridership builds on those kind of routes, we will be able to enhance those services as well as the need arises. And finally, enhancing access to transit. One of the goals of the Wake Transit Plan was to put a big chunk of the population within 3/4 of a mile of fixed route bus service. The blue shaded area here is where that exists or existed at the start of the plan. So expanding that footprint was one of the goals of the plan. So to have our population have easy access to fixed route bus service. We also created what's called the Community Funding Area Program, which is part of, it's a set aside of money within the Wake Transit funding program to allow the smaller municipalities to do bus or other transit planning, as well as implementation of capital and operating projects. Just a quick overview. This is our funding picture for FY22. The Wake Transit tax was approved, and the tax along with some other fees there you can see on the left hand side were all approved in 2016. So we spent 2017 kind of setting up the bones of the Wake Transit program and really got moving with implementation of projects in 2018. So for FY22, what we're estimating here is from all of those funding sources, $175 million to go towards public transportation in Wake County. And the state legislation, there's a footnote here that the state legislation does require that our funding from these sources be used to implement the adopted transit plan, and that they cannot replace funds that are already allocated to public transportation prior to the passage of the tax. So it's not supposed to supplant local funding. It's supposed to be used for expansion of that local funding spent on public transportation. There is what's called the Interlocal Governance Agreement, which is our Wake Transit Constitution. So the three interlocal governance parties are Campo, Go Triangle, and Wake County. Campo and Go Triangle have a laundry list of lead agency responsibilities between the two agencies, and both boards are responsible for adopting annual work plans and adopting policies that guide the expenditure of Wake Transit funds, as well as the updates to the Wake Transit plan itself. Wake County is included in the interlocal governance agreement as an advisory participant. Of course, the Wake County Commission does have representation on both the Campo and Go Triangle board, so they do directly participate that way, but they are not set up to be the sole decision maker with Wake County funding sources, because they, at the very beginning, agreed that that should be a more regional decision that would benefit the entire county and all the municipalities therein. So we also have included in that governance agreement a conference committee that can be set up should there be any discrepancy or disagreement between the two governing boards. So far, this has not had to be enacted, but it is there as kind of a safety, just in case there's any points of contention or disagreement on any of the Wake Transit program elements. The Wake Transit funding is also guided by what's called the TPAC, or the Transit Planning Advisory Committee. This is one of Campo's lead agency responsibilities. We staff the TPAC. Stephanie Plancich on our staff is our TPAC administrator. And the TPAC operates in a very similar manner to how our Technical Coordinating Committee, or TCC, operates. They provide technical recommendations up to the governing boards up to and including recommending an annual work plan and recommending updates to the Wake Transit Plan itself. The structure does currently include 3 subcommittees that are very active and help to refine some of those technical recommendations that come before the TPAC. Those are the Community Engagement Subcommittee, the Budget and Finance Subcommittee, and a Planning and Prioritization Subcommittee. So this is just to show you that the Campo Executive Board and the Go Triangle Board of Trustees are charged with setting these goals and adopting the Wake Transit Plan and communicating those goals at a high level down to both the TPAC and to our municipal agency partners. And then those municipal agency partners work through the TPAC to provide technical recommendations back up to the Campo Executive Board and the Go Triangle Board of Trustees. I mentioned there's an annual work plan for Wake Transit that's out for comment right now. Actually, there's a website here in a couple slides so that you can get to that and be able to read it and comment on it. But there's several things that go into what this work plan is. The Wake Transit Annual Work Plan is an implementation tool to help us on a year-to-year basis implement the Wake Transit Plan. So the things that go into that are recommendations from a bus plan, recommendations from the major investment studies that have been done on those larger investments, such as the commuter rail project, the bus rapid transit projects. There's a public engagement policy. There's a project prioritization policy that helps us strategize as far as funding expenditure on Wake Transit projects. There's a concurrence framework and policy. This is similar to NCDOT's merger process. What this concurrence process is meant to do is to bring all the players together that may have some kind of regulatory jurisdiction over decisions being made as part of these major transit projects. So everyone can kind of agree at certain points along the way, so we don't get into any major redo loops or have someone come in and attempt to stop a large project from moving forward because they weren't involved early enough on. I also mentioned earlier the Community Funding Area Program. We have the overall Transit Vision Plan update itself, and then at the beginning of Wake Transit World, there was a staffing plan conducted that kind of outlined some of the more administrative things that need to happen and what staff is needed amongst the various agencies to be able to deliver the Wake Transit projects and program. So these are some of the things that Campo itself is responsible for, beginning with the TPAC administration. Campo convenes the meetings, does the minutes, convenes subcommittees, things like that, and just provides general administration over the TPAC work. We also are responsible for compiling the annual work plans and doing the quarterly amendments to those. We are responsible for updating the actual Wake Transit Vision Plan, which was just updated last year to extend the horizon of the original plan because we were making such good progress on implementing the things from the original plan, and because we realized that there were projects that needed a little more certainty out into the future. Multi-year project programming. So there's a multi-year operating program and a capital improvement program that's part of the annual work plan. Campo is responsible for developing and maintaining that, which we do in close partnership with our transit project sponsors. Campo administers the Community Funding Area Program, which was set up very similarly to the LAP program that Gretchen went over a few minutes ago. That program has been very successful in the Campo region, and our members were interested in replicating that as much as possible as far as how we were selecting projects and how we were administering that program. Campo also will oversee planning studies for Wake Transit projects. Obviously, Campo is not a transit provider. We don't drive buses. We don't do bus service or demand response service or anything like that, but we excel at planning work. So right now we're doing the major investment study for the BRT extensions that I mentioned earlier today. Campo also administers the concurrence process. the project sponsors themselves are responsible for actually developing their concurrence plans, but Campo does offer technical assistance with that, and we convene concurrence meetings and document that process as well. Campo is responsible for prioritizing projects that go into the work plans and into the overall transit vision plan updates. And Campo is also responsible for designating project sponsors for Wake Transit funded projects. Some of the things that go into the annual transit work plan, you'll notice some of these boxes are actually the responsibility of other agencies. For instance, Go Triangle, as the tax district administrator, actually develops and adopts the budget ordinances for the operating and capital, and they do the funding agreements. The Go Triangle legal staff is responsible for those, but Campo is responsible for compiling all of that with all of the other things into the annual work plan. Also, as part of the annual work plan, we update our financial model assumptions and update the funding available. We do project reviews to see where projects are at as far as funding expenditures, and make sure and tighten up our budgets that way as part of our annual work plan development. As I mentioned earlier, our FY23 work plan is out for comment right now, and there's going to be a live virtual project sponsor Q&A event on March 17th, and at the website there you can go for more information and to register for that if you have questions or just want more information about the annual work plan for fiscal year 23. But in general, this is our work plan development process. Begins in the fall. We work through those project refinements and having our project sponsors submit which projects they would like to see funded in the next work plan. And we go through prioritization for that. We go through public comment and review. Then the TPAC will come together and make sure we have enough funding revenue anticipated to pay for all the things that we need to pay for in the next fiscal year. And then the TPAC will recommend a final work plan in the spring, and that will be adopted by Go Triangle and Campo boards. So as I mentioned, we recently updated the Wake Transit Vision Plan. The original vision plan was a 10-year plan from 2018 to 2027 in order to provide some more certainty on some of the larger scale projects that needed funding to be allocated beyond 2027, and to help the Wake Transit plan match up with our MTP horizon years so that we could more easily incorporate that into the transit element of the MTP. We went ahead and extended the Wake Transit plan out to 2030 as the horizon year, and that was approved last calendar year. The community funding area program has been successful so far. It is set up to allow each community within Wake County, other than Raleigh and Cary, to access these funds. That was because Raleigh and Cary already have transit plans in place and transit planning staff and are actual transit providers. So this is more meant to allow these smaller communities to have access to the funding to do some of their own community funding area planning. So the program does allocate funding for planning and then other funding for operating and capital. And as you can see there on the left, the communities across Wake County have taken advantage of this funding and are moving forward with several projects, both operating and capital here in recent years, which is exciting to see. Just real quick update on the bus rapid transit extensions major investment study. On an earlier slide, you saw the core BRT projects that were anticipated to come in each cardinal direction out of downtown Raleigh. These are extensions of those bus rapid transit projects. So it's looking to extend the bus service from Cary up to RTP and from Garner down to Clayton. There's going to be in late March another public input opportunity for these, so stay tuned for that. We do have some alternatives that are going to be reviewed and able to be discussed with the public, so we can see what kind of support there are for those various alternatives for how to get this service from the BRT lines that are already being established through Wake Transit out to these more outlying communities. And it'll also look at some fiscal issues on how to pay for those things, both capital and operations in the longer term. One other thing to mention is a new website that is available now. It's called the Wake Transit Performance Tracker. So this is a good tool to be able to visualize all the things that were included in the original Wake Transit Plan and kind of see the status of them. You can see here, this is just a screenshot. It's not the actual website itself, but I do encourage you to go on here and kind of play around with it. It's a really neat tool where you can, look at all the 15-minute service if you want, or look at all the local bus service, or you can select things by project sponsor and see all the things Raleigh is planning to do and all the things Cary is planning to do. So it's a really neat tool. Campo did oversee the development of this tool and will be maintaining it into the future as well. So your role in the Wake Transit planning process, as I mentioned, we have a TPAC and we have the governing boards of Go Triangle and Campo that are responsible for adopting the policies and the programs and the plans for Wake Transit. And we also have specialized committees that happen. There's steering committees right now for the BRT extension studies. There's steering committees for the commuter rail project. There's all sorts of planning efforts that are going on across project sponsors in the region have different steering committees and specialized committees that are working on those things. So when those things are entered into your area, your staff is typically invited to sit on those steering committees at the local level. We also have our 3 fixed route transit providers, as well as Go Wake Access, which is our rural demand response transit operated by the county. Those are the folks that we work really closely with to prioritize projects and make sure our budgets are appropriate and well refined, so that we're making efficient use of the Wake Transit funds as we move forward in time with implementing the Wake Transit plan projects. And then ways that other municipalities and agencies are involved is through our community funding area program, through participation in the development of the regional services, and through participation in the concurrence process that I mentioned. So anytime there's, if there's a station being planned as part of a BRT route in your town, you would be invited to be a participating agency in the concurrence process, just to, again, ensure that everyone is brought along and checked in with at key points along the development of those things, so that we can keep our projects moving forward in an efficient manner. And just a little note, we are currently developing a more robust Wake Transit 101 program that should be hopefully delivered here by the end of calendar 2022. One other thing I wanted to mention, I thought there was a slide, but it may have fallen out. At the conclusion of updating the Wake Transit vision plan itself, we do what's called the Wake Bus Plan update. So that's going on right now. Go Triangle is managing that process this time. And that's looking more specifically at bus routes and services and projects that will happen in the shorter term. So it's kind of drilling down further than the long range vision plan of Wake Transit, and developing some short range transit plans for our transit providers, and will help to inform future work plans moving forward. So there's different pieces and parts to that are happening right now. So you may see information about that as well. Again, that's being led by Go Triangle this time. So I'm happy to answer any Wake Transit questions if there are any, and if not, I'll pass it on to Gretchen for our final sort of section of the day. Right, I don't hear anything, so Gretchen, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
So last but not least, we are going to talk about how all of these concepts and programs that we've reviewed today turn into real projects in our region. So, sorry, catching up. Okay, so here are some, oh my gosh, okay. Sorry, my notebook was on my space bar, so that was a quick fast forward. All right, so here on this slide are a few considerations that we look at just before we consider any type of real transportation project that is funded in our region. So first, Campo, we are the Regional Transportation Planning Agency. Projects that are funded using a lot of the funding programs and mechanisms that we manage through Campo are required to comply with federal and state transportation requirements. And one of those, a major component of this is something that we call NEPA. And NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. It basically requires that any type of transportation project that you're using, especially if there's federal funding associated with that, that there is a review of that type of project to see what sort of environmental impact that there is for the project. And the outcome of this review may change the scope of the project just in consideration of the environment surrounding it. All right, so next we will jump into small projects. So the way that we're going to do this ideas to reality, first we're going to look at some small project examples, then we're going to look at what this looks like for larger projects, just because the process can be a little different. So with small projects, we're looking around $10 million, maybe a little more, maybe less, but in that range. So these smaller projects, typically what we're looking at with these are operational improvements, bike ped projects, so greenways, sidewalks, small infrastructure projects for transit. And so here on the screen, we can see the planning requirements for these types of projects. So when a small project is funded, these types of projects do need to be in the MTP, but a lot of times, since they're smaller, operational in nature, they're not shown specifically in the MTP, but they are they're included in the funding and some of the other considerations, and they're just operationally. So when these projects are funded, usually we don't see an MTP action being needed because they're already included operationally. And then on the TIP and STIP side, projects do need to be in those planning documents, especially if there's federal funding associated with it, because that is required. So when a small project is funded, usually no MTP action is needed. TIP action, STIP action will be needed just to add that associated funding with it. All right, so next we will go into a few examples of some small projects that have been funded in our region that we're really proud of. So the first one here on the screen is an RTP project. This is a LAP project, and it is for the O'Kelly Chapel Road and Lewis Stevens Drive trail connection. So this project specifically is a multi-use path that connects RTP, the town of Cary, and the town of Morrisville via Greenway. We're really proud and excited about this project because it is a great example of regional coordination, just because this project reaches 3 of our member jurisdictions and areas. So the way that this project worked is that RTP, who ultimately submitted the project to LAP, they worked closely with the town of Cary, the town of Morrisville, and with us at Campo to create a LAP submittal that would ultimately benefit all 3 of those jurisdictions. And then Campo met and worked closely with RTP to provide assistance to that organization to help perfect their LAP application prior to the LAP call for projects closing. So this project was ultimately funded. It was funded with Campo funds at 70% and then a 30% local match from RTP, and it is underway now. So they are starting their early planning and design components for this project. All right, next, another Ideas to Reality, a small project funded through LAP that we're excited about is the Town of Morrisville Airport Boulevard Extension Project. This is a new location roadway project that was submitted by the Town of Morrisville, which would extend Airport Boulevard into a complete corridor. So this project was submitted to LAP for multiple years, not only by NCDOT, but also by the Town of Morrisville. And last year, it ended up being the highest scoring roadway project for federal fiscal year 22. This is a unique project because the town and NCDOT submitted the project as a partnership. So Morrisville submitted the project, secured the funding, and will provide the local match, but NCDOT is actually going to construct and manage the project through completion. So this is another LAP project. The Campo match on this was 60%, and then the town of Morrisville provided a 40% local match. All right, and then the last small project that we wanted to review is sort of a two-parter, and this is the Rollsville Main Street project. So a little bit of background and context on this. A few years ago, the US 401 bypass was completed in Morrisville, which took traffic that historically had been going through their main street and brought it to that bypass. So that change in traffic, the opening of that roadway, created an opportunity for the town of Rollsville to reimagine what their main street should look like or what it could be now that the traffic had been moved to a different roadway. So in order to complete a planning study with this, the town reached out to Campo and had a project funded through our UPWP, which is our annual funding that we do at the MPO. For a planning study. So that study was funded and then funded through the 2018 UPWP, and the result was the Main Street Vision Plan, which provided a few recommendations or a number of recommendations for projects in and around the town of Rollsville's Main Street area in light of their transportation change. So Rollsville took that vision plan that was completed and then used it to come up with two project submittals that competed through the LAP program. So these two submittals were recommended from the vision plan and then ultimately were awarded funding through LAP. And so that is the Burlington Mills Road Realignment, which was a roadway project, and then also their Main Street Corridors Improvements Project, which was a complete streets project to help their Main Street with enhanced bicycle and pedestrian facilities on there. So this project started to address an opportunity in Rollsville with their Main Street Vision Plan and went all the way into two funded LAP projects for the town. All right, so those are some examples of some small projects that less than $10 million type projects, how that worked for the region and how that ultimately resulted in a lot of great projects that we're really excited about that should be implemented soon. So next we will go into large projects. And so for this, the examples that we're thinking about, greater than $10 million, interstates, things like that. So these are the larger regionally significant projects. So think major widenings, things like that. And these require a lot more robust planning activities just due to the scale and the impact of these projects. So these projects must be in the MTP and they have to conform to the air quality conformity standards that were mentioned earlier in the training. And then also they must be included in the TIP and the STIP. And generally they get into the TIP and the STIP by competing through that spot process that Alex shared earlier. So usually there's not enough funding at the Campo level through LAP to fund these scales of projects. So we rely heavily on SPOT to complete these types of projects for us. And so once the SPOT cycle has been completed, the TIP and the STIP are updated and they would have those new funded projects in there. So we would see those as I, which is interstate, and then R or U projects, which usually tends to refer to projects that are in a rural or an urban area. So, and then just an important thing to note again is that the TIP and the STIP must match. All right, and so last on the ideas to reality, we just wanted to point out how Campo does, or how the call for projects for these works. So Campo does something called the one call for all, which is It occurs in August of every year, and this is our call for projects where we fund all of the projects for the next federal fiscal year. So specifically what we're referring to this is the call for projects for the UPWP and for LAP for the next federal fiscal year. So this opens in August. And so during this time, our local members would submit any types of projects that they wish to have funded for the next federal fiscal year for consideration. So UPWP projects are submitted to Shelby. These are more the planning, feasibility study type projects. And then projects that are ready to go, they have been defined and figured out for the most part. Those can compete through LAP. So the small projects, operational improvements, safety improvements, things like that. And then for the MTP, the TIP for those large projects, usually that is done through the spot process, which typically occurs biennially. And so that is how those call for projects are managed and when to expect them. And with that, I believe we are finished up today. So we are happy to answer any questions. There will be a follow-up email sent with the materials from today, and I will turn it over to Chris or our directors to add any closing words, or whoever else wants to add closing words. Thanks.
Thanks, Gretchen. And thanks everyone for sticking with us through this morning, but wanted to just open it up to see if there's any questions from anyone that's on the call. All right. Well, before we leave the call, I just wanted to give Commissioner Sig Hutchinson, our current Executive Board Chair, an opportunity to speak to you all. Commissioner, are you still on?
I am, and thanks, Chris. And I want to thank everyone for sticking with us. I was looking at the participant list, and it looks like everyone pretty much stayed with us, which is a really good thing. This is 3.5 hours of a lot of information. So first, I want to thank Chris and all his team of professionals. As I say at every meeting, we've got the best team in the entire state, and you really saw it today with the information that they provided. I come to this every year because there is so much information here. It can be so complicated, and I learn something every time I come to one of these meetings. And a couple of shout outs. Number one, to Alex and the SPOT program. If this is your first time to hear the entire SPOT program from Alex and you got it all, then you're much smarter than I am. It's taken me 2 or 3 times through to really understand what's going on, but the real secret sauce in all of this is what Alex and his team does to basically maneuver the system as it's structured to be able to bring home as many projects as we can. And we're the best at in the state at it, which is once again shows the value of what our team provides. The second thing I got to give a shout to is Gretchen and the LAP program. As members, you have a huge amount of power and influence to be able to influence what's going on in your community. So we really want to encourage you to take advantage of the LAP program, which can provide funding for projects that you are really, really interested in, greenways or sidewalks or downtown improvements. And as I've once heard it said, they'll never remember you for a road that you ultimately got built, but they'll always remember you for a park or a greenway or a downtown development project that you did. So take advantage of those LAP programs. And if you have a question about something, the final thing I'll leave you with is we're here to serve you. Chris and his whole team is ready to step in if you have questions, or if you want to meet with staff, or if you have an idea that you want to kind of ferret out and find out, the feasibility and how you might be able to bring it forward. This is what these folks are here for, and they're really, really good at. So once again, I'll finish where I started by saying thank you so much for being with us today. As always, let us know how can we be of service to you, and thanks for your time. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Commissioner. And again, thanks to everyone who joined us this morning. And if you have any other questions or comments, or just want to learn more about something that you got a little taste of today, please reach out to your friendly neighborhood Campo staff. We're more than happy to talk to you, talk to your fellow board members or council members, or even come and do a presentation to your community and your organization. And with that, I think we are done. Campo staff will be sticking around on the call for a little bit here, but we know your time is very valuable and you have other things to move on to for the day. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and stay tuned for other training opportunities over the rest of this year.